Cleef talks about the 6 celebrity deaths that really got to him. To know why these deaths were so sad for Cleef, you need to know about Cleef himself, what his life was like, and the kind of movies that Cleef was a part of. Cleef was born as Clarence Leroy Van Cleef Jr. on January 9, 1925 in Somerville, New Jersey. He grew up in a family. His father was a bookkeeper. His mother took care of the home. Cleef did not have a childhood like you see in the movies. He had to be disciplined and rely on himself from an age. Cleef also learned to be quiet and watch what was going on around him. When Cleef was in the United States Navy, during World War II, these traits became even stronger. The war had an effect on him. It made him very tough. He learned to control his emotions. This toughness and control became a part of what people saw when he was on screen. He figured out that sometimes it is better to say nothing all than to say a lot. The war taught him that silence can be very powerful. This lesson really shaped the way he acted. He learned to act with the war in mind. The war helped him to say more with silence than with words, which became a big part of his acting style, the acting style of the war veteran. After the war, Van Cleef fell into acting. He did not look like the handsome guys that Hollywood liked in the 1950s. Van Cleef had a face with angles, high cheekbones, and really piercing eyes, and he was very lean. These things made Van Cleef stand out. Of holding him back, Van Cleef's looks made people remember him. Hollywood soon saw that Van Cleef was great at playing the guy, being mysterious, and making people wonder if he was good or bad. Van Cleef started out playing villains, guys with guns, and men who lived outside of society. Van Cleef was really good at playing these kinds of roles. One of the most important times we saw him was in the movie High Noon back in 1952. Even though he was in it, for a little while he was really scary. He did not say much. People still noticed him. This role helped him get into a lot of westerns and crime movies in the 1950s like Shane and The Big Combo. Van Cleef was the guy who could die in a way that people would remember, and people would still think about him long after his character was dead. Van Cleef was doing okay with his work. Then he had a really bad car accident in the late 1950s. This accident hurt his knee badly. After that, Van Cleef had a time moving around, and movie studios did not want to give him jobs, especially in movies that had a lot of action. For a time, it looked like Van Cleef was going to disappear from the movie scene. Van Cleef did not give up. He kept taking jobs on television and in projects, and he waited for something better to come along. Van Cleef was very patient, waited for the right chance. That patience paid off in the mid-1960s, not in Hollywood. In Italy, director Sergio Leone saw something in Van Cleef that others did not see, and he cast Van Cleef in for a few dollars more as Colonel Douglas Mortimer. This role changed Van Cleef overnight into an international star. Colonel Douglas Mortimer was a man. He was calm and had a lot of feelings, a man who was driven by the loss of someone he loved rather than the desire for money. Van Cleef was as good as Clint Eastwood in the movie. They were equal in being important and interesting to watch. Van Cleef and Colonel Douglas Mortimer became very famous because of this movie. He then played one of the famous bad guy roles in movie history as Angel Eyes in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Angel Eyes was really scary because he was so calm and in control. He did not get angry or loud. He was still very frightening. Van Cleef showed that the good, the bad, and the ugly character Angel Eyes did not have to yell to be the center of attention. Van Cleef was a part of European westerns in the 1960s and 1970s. He was in movies like Day of Anger, Death Rides a Horse, and The Big Gun Down. Van Cleef played characters who wanted revenge, who believed in honor, and who had their personal codes. As Van Cleef got older, he seemed more in charge. Van Cleef appeared to be very wise, a little dangerous, and very experienced. He was like a hero, not a typical one. Van Cleef was more like an anti-hero from a myth. In the 1980s, he became known to a generation because of movies like The Octagon with Chuck Norris and Escape from New York. When he was not the star, people still took notice of him because he was in the movie. The movies were better with him in them. He was also in a television show called The Master. In this show, he played a ninja who was wise and taught others. This role was great for him because he is a disciplined person. Unfortunately, the show did not last long. Van Cleef was in 90 movies by the time his career ended. He was also in then 100 television shows. People thought Van Cleef was a professional. Van Cleef was respected by people of all ages and from different places. Behind the look Lee Van Cleef was a man who thought a lot about things. He was really hurt by some things that happened to him. Later in his life, Lee Van Cleef talked openly about the deaths of 6 people that still bothered him a lot. Number 1. Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper's death in 1961 had an impact on Van Cleef. He really looked up to Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper was an actor who showed that you do not have to be loud or act crazy to be good on screen. Van Cleef liked the way Gary Cooper could be quiet and still be in charge. This is something that Van Cleef tried to do in his acting. When Gary Cooper died, Van Cleef felt like something was missing in Hollywood. To Van Cleef, Gary Cooper was a man with a lot of dignity and self-control. Gary Cooper also stood up for what was right. Van Cleef took these things with him when he acted in movies. He wanted to be like Gary Cooper in every role he played. Number 2. Robert Ryan. Robert Ryan died in 1973. This really affected Lee Van Cleef. Robert Ryan was like Lee Van Cleef because he also played men who were not always good or bad. Lee Van Cleef thought Robert Ryan understood the things in life in a real way, not just as something fake, but as something that really happens to people. Lee Van Cleef liked that Robert Ryan was willing to look uncomfortable when he acted, to try to show the truth of just trying to be liked. When Robert Ryan died, Lee Van Cleef realized that there were not actors left who were willing to be that honest. Lee Van Cleef and Robert Ryan were similar in that they both played characters that were complicated, and Robert Ryan's death made Lee Van Cleef think about how rare it's to find actors like Robert Ryan. Number 3. John Wayne. John Wayne died in 1979. That was the end of a big part of movie history. Van Cleef thought John Wayne was an important figure in American movies. Even though Van Cleef and John Wayne made kinds of films, Van Cleef looked up to John Wayne. When John Wayne died, the Western movie genre was never the same. The movie started to be more about thinking and less about stories. John Wayne was not there anymore. That made Van Cleef think about how his own time was coming to an end. The people who made movies, like John Wayne and Van Cleef, were getting older, would not be around forever. John Wayne's death reminded Van Cleef of this. Number 4. Richard Boone. Richard Boone died in 1981. This really got to Van Cleef. The thing about Richard Boone was that he was super smart and never backed down. He did not like it when people told him what to do. Richard Boone thought acting was a deal, and he wanted to do it right. Van Cleef liked that Richard Boone would not give in to what the movie people wanted. When Richard Boone died, it felt like Van Cleef lost someone who really cared about acting. Richard Boone was one of the people who thought acting was important for more than just being famous or making money. Van Cleef admired Richard Boone for this. Number 5. Henry Fonda. Henry Fonda died in 1982. That was really the end of an era. To Lee Van Cleef, Henry Fonda was a man. Henry Fonda always seemed like a guy, even when he played bad guys in movies. Henry Fonda had a career, and he always knew what was right and wrong. Lee Van Cleef liked that about Henry Fonda. When Henry Fonda died, Lee Van Cleef felt like the old Hollywood was coming to an end. These actors, like Henry Fonda, were important to Lee Van Cleef. They were the ones who kept the movie business stable. Number 6. Sergio Leone. Sergio Leone's death in 1989 was really tough for a lot of people. It was a deal. Sergio Leone did a lot for Van Cleef. He did not just give Van Cleef a role in his movies. He helped Van Cleef become a star again. Van Cleef thought that if it was not for Sergio Leone, nobody would have known how good he really was. Sergio Leone had a vision for his movies, and he believed in Van Cleef. This changed Van Cleef's life. When Sergio Leone died, Van Cleef felt like he lost the one person who really understood him. Losing Sergio Leone was like losing a part of himself. Sergio Leone was the one man who truly saw Van Cleef. When Van Cleef thinks about these deaths, he shows that he is a sensitive person. Every time someone dies, Van Cleef remembers that nothing lasts forever. Van Cleef knows that famous people, like legends, can become memories in a very short time. Van Cleef thinks about this a lot when people die. Van Cleef had a lot of health problems for a time, like heart disease, and he even had a pacemaker. Van Cleef kept on working until the very end. Then, on December 16, 1989, Van Cleef had a bad heart attack at his home in Oxnard, California. This heart attack was fatal. Van Cleef was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park. The words on Van Cleef's grave say "Best of the Bad." It was a fitting epitaph. Lee Van Cleef made audiences fear him, admire him, and remember him. Decades later, his legacy endures, proving that true legends never fade.